Hi guys, good evening. It is really hot in here. Jeez. I know we'll have to turn the air conditioner on tonight. It's getting hard to breathe in here. I got this book called Dreams and Miracles. And I haven't read any of the stories yet, but I thought we'd read one together tonight because I thought it sounded interesting. I was hoping it might be something you guys would like. It's called The Dream That Wouldn't Go Away. So doesn't that sound interesting? So I'm going to see if he or she dreamed something and maybe it came true. Wouldn't that be so neat? So let's just see. It's by George Hunt. George Hunt couldn't get the young couple out of his mind. He'd heard the news reports about Dr. Robert Dykes and his wife Marjorie, a young couple from California whose plane had gone down for 4 days. He didn't know then that he would become the answer to the prayer he whispered before going to bed that night. Dear God, if they're alive, send someone to them so they will be able to get back to their family. Back when I was a young livestock rancher north of Roosevelt, Utah, the news one cold November morning reported that a California doctor and his wife were missing on a flight from Custer, South Dakota to Salt Lake City. As a student pilot, I had just completed my first cross-county flight with an instructor, though I had only 20 solo hours. Paying close attention to all the radio reports on the search, I was very disturbed 2 days later by a newscast saying that Dr. Robert Dykes and his wife Marjorie, both in their late 20s and parents of 2 young children, were not likely to be found until spring, and maybe not even then. They had been missing 4 days, and the temperature had been below zero every night. There seemed little chance of their survival without food and proper clothing. That night before I retired, I said a simple prayer for these 2 people I didn't know. Dear God, if they're alive, send someone to help them so they will be able to get back to their family. After a while, I drifted off to sleep. In a dream, I saw a red plane on a snow-swept ridge and 2 people waving for help. I awoke with a start. Was it the Dykes? What color was the plane? I didn't remember any of the news reports ever mentioning it. I couldn't get back to sleep for some time. I kept reasoning that because I'd been thinking of the couple before falling asleep, it was natural for me to dream of them. When I finally did go to sleep, the dream came again. A red plane on a ridge, but now farther away. I could see 2 people waving, and I could now see some snow-covered mountain peaks in the background. I got out of bed and spread out the only air chart I owned. It covered a remote area in Utah, the high region, along the Wyoming-Utah border. The Dykes flight plan presumably had to pass over this range. I was familiar with the rugged terrain, for I had finished and hunted it as a boy. My eyes scanned the names on the chart: Bureau Peak, Painter's Basin, Kings Peak, Gilbert Peak. Again I went to bed, and again, incredibly, the dream returned. Now the plane was barely in sight. I could see a valley below. Then it came to me in a flash: Painter's Basin and Gilbert Peak. I rose in a cold sweat. It was daylight. Turning on the news, I found there had been no sign of the plane, and the search had been called off. All day long, doing chores around the ranch, I could think of nothing but the Dykes and my dream. I felt God had shown me where those people were, and that they were alive. But who would believe me, and what could I do about it? I knew I wasn't really qualified to search for them myself. I knew, too, that even trying to explain my dream to my flight instructor, a stern taskmaster named Joe Mower, he would have laughed me out of the hangar. I decided to go to our small Royal Airport anyway. When I arrived, a teenage boy who was watching the plane told me Joe had gone to town for the mail. The force had been nudging me all morning, seemed to say, "Go." I had the boy help me push a plane out. When he asked where I was going, I said to look for the dikes. I gave the plane the throttle and was on my way. Trimming out, I began a steady climb and headed for Uinta Canyon. I knew what I was doing was unwise, even dangerous, but the danger seemed a small thing compared to what I felt in my heart. As I turned east near Painter's Basin, I was beginning to lose faith in my dream. There was no sign of the missing plane. The high winds, downdrafts, and rough air were giving me trouble in the small 65-horsepower plane. Terribly disappointed as well as frightened, I was about to turn back when suddenly there it was, a red plane on Gilbert Peak, just as I had seen in my dream. Coming closer, I could see two people waving. I was so happy I began to cry. "Thank you, God," I said over and over. Opening the plane's window, I waved at the dikes and wigwagged my wings to let them know I saw them. Then I said a prayer to God to help me get back to the airport safely. 30 minutes later, I was on the ground. When I taxied up and cut the motor, I gulped, for Joe Mower was there to greet me. "You're grounded," he hollered. "You had no permission to take the plane up." "Joe," I said quickly, "I know I did wrong, but listen, I found the dikes and they need help." "You're crazy," Joe said, and he continued to yell at me. My finding that plane in an hour and a half, when hundreds of planes had searched in vain for nearly a week, was more than Joe could believe. Finally, I turned away from Joe, went straight for the telephone, and did what I should have done in the first place. I called the CAP, Civil Air Patrol, in Salt Lake City. When they answered, I asked if there had been any word on the Dykes plane. They said there was no chance of them being alive now, and that the search was ended. "Well, I found them," I said, "and they are both alive." Behind me, Joe stopped chewing me out, his eyes wide in his mouth. "I'll round up food and supplies." I continued to the CAP, and the people here will get it to them as soon as possible. The CAP gave me the go-ahead. Everyone at the airport went into action, and within 1 hour we were on our way. A local expert pilot would fly in the supplies. I would lead the way in another plane. I wasn't grounded for long. Back in the air, we headed for the high peaks. Hal's plane was bigger and faster than the one I was in. He was flying out ahead of me. When I got to Painter's Basin at 11,000 feet, I met the severe downdrafts again. I could see Hal circling above me and knew he was in sight of the downed plane and ready to drop supplies. Since I couldn't go higher, I turned around. Back at the airport, I joined a 3-man ground rescue party, which would attempt to reach the couple by horseback. Another rescue party had already left from Wyoming side of the mountains. For the next 24 hours, our party hiked through fierce winds and 6-foot snowdrifts. At 12,000 feet, on a ridge near Gilbert Peak, we stopped. In the distance, someone was yelling. Urging our frozen feet forward, we pressed on, tremendously excited. Suddenly, about 100 yards in front of us, the small red plane rammed into a snowbank. Nearby, 2 people flapped their arms wildly. Charging ahead, we shouted with joy. At about the same time we reached the dikes, the other rescue party was coming over the opposite ridge. After much hugging and thanking, I learned what a miracle the Dykes' survival was. They had had nothing to eat but a candy bar, and their clothing was scant. Miss Dykes had a fur coat, but her husband had only a top coat. The altitude made starting a fire impossible, and at night they huddled together in their down plane, too afraid to go to sleep. We had all but given up and even written notes as to who should look after our children, Miss Dykes said. Then turning to me, she said, "But when we saw your plane, it was the most wonderful thing. Our prayers answered, dreams come true." "Yes," I said, smiling, suddenly feeling as Solomon in the Bible must have felt after he received a visit from the Lord one night in a dream. 1 Kings 3:5-14. My dream, like Solomon's, had occurred for a reason. In his own special way, God gave me that dream in order to help give life to 2 others. Even in the most mysterious of ways, he had shown me he is always there, always listening. He had heard my prayers and the Dykes' prayers, and had answered all of us in his own infallible way. The end. So wasn't that amazing? God gave him that dream after he prayed for those people, and he found them, and they were still alive. So he saved them. God saved them. Isn't that amazing? So I thought that was a really good story, and this is a true story, by the way. So, the dream that wouldn't go away. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and maybe I will read another one in the near future. Bye, guys.